You're no longer going to naively think that somehow our period in time is immune from the kind of rampant anti-Semitism that has always been.
Welcome to Extremely, a podcast from the ADL Center on Extremism. I'm Oren Segal.
And I'm Jessica Reaves.
And today we're going to do a deep dive, not only into what is Hamas, how did we get here, but what is ADL doing to help hold accountable those who are responsible for the massacre by talking with our litigation team. So, Jessica, we're going to start with Matt Levitt, expert on Hamas and Hezbollah, who's really going to give us, I think, some interesting thoughts about where we're at and what is possible in sort of this post-October 7th world. After hearing Matt Levitt, and then especially our colleague James Pasch, who will talk about ADL's landmark litigation, you're going to feel not only smarter, but you're going to feel like maybe, just maybe, there is justice around the corner. So our guest today, one of our guests today, Matthew Levitt, is a senior fellow and director of the Washington Institute's Reinhard Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence. You probably know Matt from serving as Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of Treasury. This is a couple of years ago. Also as an advisor at the State Department and as the FBI Counterterrorism Intelligence Analyst. The man has literally written the books about Hamas and Hezbollah. He's somebody who I always turn to get a better understanding of what's happening in the world of terrorism. And we are just so excited that you're able to join us for this burgeoning podcast. Thank you, Matt, for being here. We wanted to talk to you, Matt, because one of the questions that we try to answer is like, what the hell is going on? And, since October 7th, not only the attack by Hamas against Israeli civilians, but the, subsequent attacks that we're seeing coming from the north with Hezbollah, the Iranian conflict that is involved in this. But I think a lot of people really want to understand what has occurred. People are still trying to figure out how the heck did that happen. Can I ask you a question that I know is complicated, and I know it jumps, really far into the sort of broader conflict, but how did such a massive massacre happen in a country that is essentially created to prevent that from ever happening again?
So I think it's a combination of two primary things. The first is a misunderstanding of Hamas strategy. And here I include myself, mea culpa. I'll just give an example because I don't have access to classified anymore. But in the summer before October 7th, actually a year ago, just now, July, Salah al-Aruri, the deputy head of Hamas, who was subsequently killed in a rocket attack in Beirut, went on Hezbollah's Al-Manar television. And in the context of increasing violence in the West Bank, and the Israelis were intimating that maybe they would resume targeted assassinations, he said, "I'm not afraid to die." Oh, and by the way, he says, as an aside, but we all saw it. He says, by the way, we're planning regional war. Now, we all, myself included, took it, as they say in Arabic, kalam fadi, empty words, big talk. They're trapped in Gaza. They got nothing they can do, so they talk big. Right? That was a colossal miscalculation. From the Israeli side, they were convinced, they call it the conception, Hebrew, the conceptia, of assuming, believing that Hamas truly was invested in its governance project in Gaza, and that was more important to them being able to fight Israel on a regular basis. It was more important to them to keep the calm, to have the money flowing from Qatar. And the second thing is assuming, this hubris of the conceptia that you got them where you want them, that they can't get past your physical barriers, that you've got all this tech. In fact, shortly before October 7th, the Israelis moved a number of forces from the Gaza envelope to the West Bank because things were getting hot there. And the assumption was the tech would do the trick. The assumption was we have all these really sharp young women who are there as spotters with binoculars, spotters at computer terminals. But then when push came to shove and these brilliant young women said, hey, we're seeing stuff, they were completely ignored. By the way, in part because they were women. And there was a level upon level of hubris. And when you have hubris and a failed assessment, tactical and strategic assessment, it combines to very, very bad things.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Matt. I mean, that was something I was going to ask you about is, these reports about these women who kept telling their supervisors, we're seeing these activities, we're seeing these essentially practice runs for what was going to happen. And they were dismissed out of hand. Israel prides itself on having a sort of very super egalitarian military. But what does that really mean if you're not listening to the people who have the information?
Look, I think there is an element of some of the older men in the military, not recognizing that these young women were selected for these positions because they were really capable. They were right. They were ignored. I mean, there's no sugarcoating that. But I think that part of the problem gets to what Oren was asking earlier. I mean, part of the problem is that Israelis are really, really good at intelligence. They're really, really good at security and military. And sometimes that too can be a problem because you're convinced of your own capabilities. So in this case, there were two things. One is the Israelis did collect information on something they termed, not Hamas, but they termed Operation Jericho, that Hamas was planning something, but it was notional. And the Israelis felt that they had addressed it. Right. And that, sure, they'll talk about these things, but at the end of the day, they are trapped in Gaza. You want to talk about some of the planning? One of the things I saw that blew my mind is it looks like just a square or rectangle frame. And I asked the person who was showing, what is this? He goes, well, this is a custom made explosive device. Some of those times when they had protests up along the fence and they were, filling balloons with stuff that would set fields on fire and sometimes bags of manure and stuff like that. Well, they were also behind all of that, having people go to the fence, which was not the exact same thing every place, and measure specific components. And then they'd come back and they'd manufacture a frame to fit that exact component, fill it with C4, and you'd have a custom made frame for that particular section of the wall. Like that's the level of planning that was going on here. So I think part of the problem was that the Israelis knew there was something they thought they had. Okay, so they've got a replica of a kibbutz somewhere and they're working on it. All right, we know they're doing this, but they still can't get past our automated rifles and all of our sensors. And we stopped them below ground. I really think there was an element of what are they going to go above ground? They're going to fly into Israel with their non-existent Air Force, right? And what we're now left with 9 months later is this. It's still shock, but not so much on the South, right? In the South, you had the initial shock of October 7th, the subsequent shock that the tunnel system that they knew about was many times more significant than they thought. But now in the North, right? And the fear that Hezbollah could end up doing this in the North, the October 7th plan, fire rockets, storm across the border, kill people, take hostages. This was a Hezbollah Radwan forces, their special forces plot that Hamas's, frankly, less capable Nukba forces implemented, right? So there's no telling me that Hezbollah and Iran didn't know about it. They didn't know about October 7th. They were shocked that morning, but strategically they knew. This is where they got the idea.
You mentioned your work sort of post 9/11 here in the United States, and obviously there was a lot of shock and a lot of, in hindsight, mistakes that were realized, that, signals that should have been caught. And there's some similarities there. That resulted in the war on terror. And what a lot of people are hearing here is, this ambition of the war to eliminate Hamas.
So from October 9th, since October 9th, I've been telling anybody who will listen, including lots of people in Israel, stop saying this is about destroying Hamas. Stop saying the goal is to destroy Hamas. And I've certainly not been in favor of prosecuting this effort by slogan, which is what Netanyahu's total victory is. It's a slogan. It doesn't mean anything. It's not because I suddenly have gone soft on Hamas. It's because, when the U.S. built an international coalition to defeat the Islamic State. We didn't destroy the Islamic State. Islamic State still exists. What we did do is we inflicted territorial defeat on the Islamic State. We ended the Islamic State governance project, and we inflicted significant military defeat on the Islamic State so that as a military entity, it could not function anymore, and then continued to take the fight to them as an insurgent or terrorist group to continue to knock them down the side, which is doesn't have a end date on it. That's an ongoing effort. And so you've had some pretty senior Israeli officials just within the last week or two say, look, Hamas is an idea. You're not going to defeat an idea. I think anybody who thinks you're going to destroy down to the last Hamas guy in Gaza is going to have a rude awakening. Not only will that not happen, you have Hamas in the West Bank, you have Hamas in Lebanon, you have Hamas in Turkey, in Qatar, etc. But what Israel has already significantly achieved is destroying the governance project. The real question is if they will allow that victory to slip away by refusing to say what comes next. And if they don't allow something to come next, even if that something is run by or tied to the incredibly corrupt and frustratingly ineffective Palestinian Authority, because it's what's there, like we need something. The idea that certain family groups are going to run a bubble and then the bubble will expand, it's just not realistic. You won't get Arab states, the international community to support that. There has to be something actually there. They have successfully destroyed a significant amount of the Hamas fighting force by killing and severely injuring a significant portion of those 30,000 or so fighters. And they've also successfully destroyed a significant amount of their fighting power, of their weaponry, of their lathes to be able to build rockets, to build IEDs, etc. I'm sure there isn't everything. And they have succeeded far less in terms of destroying the tunnel infrastructure, which is very, very difficult to do. You can't blow all of it up. It's very complicated, but they've knocked out a lot of it. So there's a lot of things that they've tactically succeeded in doing. The problem is Hamas went into this with a strategy. What they wanted to do on October 7th was not destroy Israel by October 8th or October 8th the following year. They wanted to start a process from their perspective, an irreversible, unstoppable process that will ultimately, in whatever number of years or decades, lead to Israel's destruction. They truly believe that. And they're willing to take huge hits for that. It's distasteful to let the Hamas words come out of my mouth, but they have said they are welcoming, they wanted Palestinian deaths to be able to get world opinion. That was the strategy. That's why they built tunnels for the fighters and no shelters for the civilians. And the ultimate thing we have to now really be careful to prevent is that they are able to survive with enough influence to make themselves part of the governance project that comes next.
I'm curious, from your perspective, do you think they expected Americans and Europeans to some extent to respond in the way that they did, essentially supporting, an Islamist extremist group in the streets at some of these protests?
I think that you and I are surprised by the level of what is ultimately pro-Hamas. I'm not talking about the pro-Palestinian support on campuses or elsewhere, with which, even when I disagree with it, I have no problem with it. But when the explicitly pro-Hamas, pro-PFLP, pro-Hezbollah stuff comes like that, I definitely have an issue with. And I'll just tell you, by the way, so does the FBI. But only you and I are surprised, right? I'm not saying that Students for Justice in Palestine and other groups had any idea October 7th was coming. That is not what I'm saying. But I think it's very, very clear that they were planning for a day, whenever it would come, when they could leap into action and be much more vocal in their support for resistance targeting civilians that is not about 1967 and is not about occupation, but is about 1948 and Israel's right to exist, and therefore anything Zionism is bad, that they were clearly prepared for. Because the day after October 7th, right, about 2 weeks before the IDF went into Gaza at all, when the only thing that happened was Jewish civilians, almost all of whom were the most far left, most peace process people out there in Israel, were literally massacred and kidnapped and raped and just parents in front of children, etc. That's all that had happened so far. They come out with flyers showing, armed men in hand gliders and talking about Zionism and Israel's right to exist. I think there were things happening that a bunch of us just weren't paying attention to, because what they weren't doing is what we would expect. Big political conversations, trying to talk to people on the Hill. Instead, the people who are promoting this message now on college campuses and elsewhere decided quite a few years ago to stop making the United States the primary fundraising place for Hamas. They decided not to do that anymore, instead to engage in a culture war and to latch themselves onto other pre-existing social causes in a way that doesn't ignore it. It's against nuance. You see, you don't need nuance to know if you're for women's rights or not. Like, are you good or are you bad? You don't need nuance to know are you for African-American rights or not, right? Or are you for or against a policeman putting his boot in the neck? You don't need nuance, or you don't need nuance here either. But the other reason they don't want nuance is because the nuance doesn't allow for space of, so are some Israelis okay or all Israelis bad? Is a two-state solution okay? Or it's this version of supporting Palestinians, which ultimately is supporting Hamas in this case.
I used to, remember protests in New York in 2000 after the, Second Intifada or during other conflicts. And there was some nasty stuff. There was not Houthi flags that, America, Jews, Israel are evil. There were PFLP, Hezbollah, and Hamas flags. Maybe you'd see one and it would be rare. Now it is like part of the routine, got the mask, okay, got my water, got my mobile phone, got my terrorist flag. It almost seems like it's part of the routine. I am shocked that it's become that way. And so the question is and I know this is hard to answer, when did it become okay to ignore the violence against Jews? Or am I answering my own question by just looking at 2,000 years of history? There's just something that I still cannot, dots that I'm not connecting. When I see, flyers of missing children, or those who are, not missing, hostages who are being ripped down, I'm sorry, I've been doing this for 20 something years and I still can't wrap my mind around why somebody would do that.
When Oren Segal tells you, I can't understand why this extremism is happening, you tell me, you're in a bad position. Look, I can't exactly answer it. I can tell you that this process that I was telling you about that shifted towards latching on to social causes in a way that just makes it obvious, this intersectionality, you must be in favor of all these things or you're not really. I know I spoke to one Jewish person who's gay, who's gotten pressure from friends. Maybe you're not actually gay because you haven't been pro-Palestinian in camps. I mean, yeah. Look, when it was just pulling off posters of kidnapped children and we were pulling our hair out, what kind of a jerk? And I think part of it comes down to we didn't recognize how successful people had been at demonizing Israel. And for these people, these are Zionist, settler, whatever they want to, they're all bad. And you had this coming somehow. It's uncomfortable even letting words pass my lips, but there are people who actually believed this. The second thing is we're living, unlike 20 something years ago, in an age of severe disinformation and misinformation. And so there's all kinds of stuff going on where people just don't believe, fill in the blank. There are tons of people who believe October 7th didn't happen. Anybody who was killed that isn't a fake death was killed by Israeli helicopters.
I gotta ask, since you literally wrote the books, that so many people learned about Hamas, Hezbollah, could you have imagined, I guess, that they would have been, and I hate to use the word successful, but that they would have been able to achieve such volume of evil and murder and impact that they achieved on October 7th prior to it happening? Did you think they could really do that? And I'm asking about Hamas specifically, not Hezbollah.
I did not anticipate Hamas doing something like this or being anywhere near this, I hate to say it, but successful. And the success is not just the tactical, operational, bloody massacre success of October 7th. It's everything that's followed.
The winning the hearts and minds of youth across the world, that sort of stuff as well, right?
That murdering a bunch of people, it would put the Palestinian cause back on the agenda in any way. I think part of it is because maybe we didn't appreciate exactly how much they had built the tunnels. And I've been in 6 Hamas tunnels that were stopped, tunnels coming into Israel. These internal domestic tunnels, everybody kept saying there are a lot, but nowhere near as many as we found out. And the idea was, well, Hamas is worried that the IDF is going to storm into Gaza. And so this is to, pop out of tunnels and Viet Cong, inflict casualties on the Israelis. In fact, we now know that it was actually an offensive tactic. We're going to do something. We're going to force the Israeli hand. We're going to do something so horrible that they'll have no choice, and then we'll be able to use all these tunnels. And I think now this is forcing people, certainly people in Israel, I can tell you having just been there, but even people outside, to reassess not just the security situation from the south, but much more so the security situation from the north, where Hezbollah is many times more capable, and the Israelis are just no longer willing to live with a gun to their heads, not from the south and not from the north.
I mean, I just think it just reminds us you can never underestimate, terrorists and extremists and others and what they're capable of, especially when they tell you what they want to do. I want to switch gears a little bit and just ask another question, so I know we have some limited time left, because we can't just be sad sacks all the time. I mean, has anything in all of this given you any hope?
Look, I do have. There are silver linings to this. Some of them are very tactical. So, for example, Iran decided to fire 300 some munitions at Israel April 13th, 14th. There has never been a better commercial, very successful commercial, for the need for there to be integrated Middle East regional air defense involving Israel and the Gulf states and Jordan, etc., and U.S. Central Command, and driving home for everybody the very, very real threat that Iran presents. And I do think it's been a wake-up call. The three of us have grown up in generations that just did not know this kind of rampant anti-Semitism, and it's the exception, I hate to say. And we lived in a bubble, and now we're surprised. And Israel is not going to be destroyed. And Jews around the world are not going to be destroyed. But when the chief rabbi of France says, I don't think there's a future for Jews in France, that's a big wake-up call, not only for Jews, but for the countries in which they're in. Mm-hmm. And I do think at the end of the day, we're going to come out of this and there'll be a new normal. And Israel won't be under threat every day, and it won't have displaced persons living in hotels every day. And it won't have to, this too shall pass, not for a while, but it will. But we will be better prepared for the next round, and there will be more rounds, because we're no longer going to naively think that somehow our period in time is immune from the kind of rampant anti-Semitism that has always been.
Man, you just made good news sound a little sad. That was unbelievable. That's right.
It's a special skill.
Well, Matt, I just want to thank you for taking the time to explain your thoughts on these things. Give us, I think, an audience perspective that is really critical. I think it's just really important that people hear what you do, and I just appreciate you bringing some of that to our podcast here. So wish you the best. We'll see you soon. All right. Well, I think that was mostly fun, Jessica, talking to Matt. I think we learned a lot. He managed to actually give me hope, even though, it was guarded.
Sometimes
right?
that's the best we can ask for these days.
It is. And so the good news is we're following up now after that really great conversation with Matt, with one of our colleagues who one of the best colleagues you can actually ask for to talk with us about ADL's landmark lawsuit filed against Iran, Syria, and North Korea. So before I introduce James Pasch, I want to just let people know that on July 1st, ADL and the law firm Crowell and Mooring filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of more than 125 plaintiffs against Iran, Syria, and North Korea, alleging that those countries provided material support to Hamas in its brutal attack against Israel. Plaintiffs include U.S. citizens that were injured or killed and immediate family members of those that were killed and injured. James Pasch, ADL Senior Director of National Litigation, is here with us to discuss the details of this landmark case and why ADL chose to take it on. James, welcome to Extremely. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks, Oren. Thanks, Jessica.
This is a really, sort of unbelievable first in many ways for ADL. ADL has been involved in litigation over the years, but nothing quite at this level. Why was it important for ADL to file this lawsuit? And can you explain that lawsuit a little bit?
When you take a step back, we are the lead organization globally in the fight against anti-Semitism, the fight against extremism. And what we're talking about on October 7th is the most deadly anti-Semitic attack that the world has seen since the Holocaust, right? And you couple the horrors of what occurred that day with almost the equal horror of how the world has responded and almost the minutes after the attack, right? The October 7th denialism that started becoming mainstream across the United States and Europe felt like within minutes, right? And so ADL has a vital role, I would even argue an obligation, to figure out the most forceful way to push back against that denialism, and to show the world exactly what occurred on the morning of October 7th, who was responsible for it occurring, and to bring justice to a group of victims whose voice is being ignored. When I think about the impact that this case can and should have, and ADL's role in it, I think that quite possibly nothing is more important than right now telling the stories of what occurred on October 7th and showing through facts exactly what happened and who was responsible for it happening.
And you've been doing this for a while, James. You've been in this space for a while. You sort of are familiar with, the landscape of both anti-Semitism, extremism, and I'm also from the litigation perspective. How is this suit different from what you've worked on before?
Well, the suit's certainly different, right, than the other suits that we've had before, whether that's our suit against the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers for their action on January 6th, whether it's a lawsuit against White Lives Matter for the firebombing of a church in Ohio, right? A lot of our lawsuits have been against domestic extremist organizations, right? And this suit is obviously different because it's against foreign national entities, right? In Iran and Syria and North Korea. But I think one of the untold stories of October 7th is that Hamas did not have the capability of executing an attack of that size and that magnitude without the support of other surrounding entities, including actual nation states that provided material support, whether through technology, weapons, direct financing, etc. Right? The attack did not occur in the vacuum, and the world needs to know that it did not occur in a vacuum, right? And this case will show the kind of the web of complications of who was attached to it. And when it first got brought up as a possibility, and my first thought was, let's figure out how to devote every resource possible in the litigation lens to take an idea and make it a reality, right? And this started with thinking to ourselves, it would be great if we could get a handful of plaintiffs, and it just kept growing, right? And to the point where on the day of the filing, we had 130 individual plaintiffs. And, this is not just, it's not a class action suit, right? It's 130 individual claims, and every plaintiff has their own story to tell and their own damages, right? And so allowing the voice of those individuals to be presented through affidavits over the course of this case is going to be very powerful, because the reality is that there were many lives that on October 8th were never the same as they were on October 6th, and will never be the same. We talk about justice and what does justice look like. Justice will never look like making these people whole. Right? I can't give back loved ones that were lost, right? We can't make people the same mentally and emotionally that they were on October 6th, right? And so we can't do that, right? What we can do is to provide some redress, some accountability.
I want to pull the thread a little bit about one of the things you just said, because clearly this is partially about accountability, but it's also about the ability to tell like history, tell stories for future generations. How much did you all think about the fact that here you are memorializing like actually what happened in history?
I think for many of our plaintiffs, and certainly for ADL, I don't even know that it's secondary as much as it is a primary part of this lawsuit. There has been such a silencing of the voices of the victims of October the 7th. And this doesn't just make their voices heard now, it makes it heard in the halls of history forever. I think a lot about one of our plaintiffs who's spoken out publicly, Nahar Netta, right? I think about him on the phone that morning with his mom. I think about his siblings being on the phone with their mom when the terrorists barged into her home at Kibbutz Be'eri, and that the last thing they heard was the screams, right? I think the world needs to hear that story, and they need to hear about their mom, right? They need to hear that she was the midwife for all the kibbutzim in the area, that she spent her whole career bringing life into the world, and she tragically lost her own life that morning, right? And the world will hear her story because of this case, right? And I don't think there's a dollar figure that you could put on the importance of that.
I think it's so important, as you point out, to humanize these numbers, to humanize all of the stories that we hear. And I think, it has a broader impact as well. It's validating for the people who had these horrific experiences. It's critical for the world to hear these stories. But also, I do think that in sort of the broader, I'm sure this is not the point of the lawsuit, but in the broader kind of global psychology, the more we can tell the human tragedies, and the more we can make people understand that these were people just like you, these were people who cared about the same things, or that had the same number of kids as you did, or who had the same number of grandkids, all of that helps to, one hopes, sort of jumpstart the empathy globally.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, right? We get lost sometimes in statistics, and I think one of the high levels of importance of a case like this is the understanding that every person, every quote statistic, is a grandparent, a parent, a brother, a sister, and there's a real human element to that. That my hope is the world sees. There's another important thing I want to mention, which is, I'd say the question I get asked a lot from people is, so you get these families some sort of judgment. What are they supposed to do with that, right? How are you going to collect a $5 million judgment against Iran? or Syria and North Korea, right? And I think it's really important to also mention the financial part of this for these families, which is important, right? Because as I said earlier, we can't bring people back who are gone, and we can't make people whole. But one thing that we try to do through the justice system is to assign some sort of dollar value to those damages to assist with families. And right in the United States in 2015, we created the U.S. Victim of Foreign Terror Fund, right? And unfortunately, the last few years, that fund has not been operating at the level that Congress anticipated that it operate at. And for that reason, there's a bipartisan bill in Congress that dropped this past session with 30 bipartisan co-sponsors in the House, and it's sponsored by Josh Gottheimer on the Democratic aisle and Mike Lawler on the Republican aisle. And it is to confirm Congress's intent of how the fund was supposed to work, which is all of the sanctions and fines against companies that are illegally doing business with state sponsors of terror, and that money go into the fund, right, to fund these families, not just the October 7 families, but all American victims of foreign terrorism that receive a judgment in court go to this fund. So you're talking about 18,000 families right now that are relying on this fund to exist, and to not just exist, but exist properly and giving out annual payments towards their judgments. And so really important. ADL's put a lot of weight on the government advocacy side behind this current bill.
Well, we're happy that you're taking it on, James. And again, as Oren said, I think they found the right person. So thank you for all your work on the behalf of these families and for ADL. And we are also very grateful to you for joining the podcast. I'm happy that people are getting to hear more about what's going on in the legal world and in our litigation world, which I know is always very busy.
Yeah, and people should know, like, this case is massive. It's beyond anything that ADL's ever done. But like the litigation efforts of James and his team in working closely with the Center on Extremism on holding accountable bad actors, I mean, frankly, is one of the exciting parts of the work that we do. So, James, we appreciate not just you coming on the podcast, not just sort of helping lead this massive effort and to try to hold people accountable and tell stories, but just your day-to-day partnership with us is much appreciated. So that's I don't think I can say anything nice about you now for a month, so I think I got it all in. But it is meant truthfully, and thank you.
Thank you, Oren. Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate.
Thank you so much for being here. So that was a really fascinating sort of insight. It was a peek behind the curtain, which we don't often get, into the process of litigation. How did we decide to move ahead with this kind of lawsuit? What James certainly hopes will be the result. And I think, that was really, really interesting, and hopefully not just for us, but for our listeners / viewers. So thanks again to James and to Matt for joining us.
And I hope I didn't sound kind of like too cynical about lawyers, but like there's something different about this case. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm, more understanding about the process here. I've talked to James, but he said it, you don't give justice to people who have lost everything, but you can try in certain ways, and telling their stories actually can go a long way. And I don't know, I think that's pretty cool.
It is. It's very cool.
So maybe that's my life raft, or I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, we do need to cover our life rafts. So what is keeping you afloat this week? And you can feel free to reach back to the person we just talked to. I'm sure James would be thrilled to know that he's your life raft.
So I will just say, you know what? James is my life raft. So I'll go first this time. And not just because of this important litigation, his sort of leadership in this area, his great partnership with all of us in the center and in the agency, but because like he's somebody, I'll just be honest, I don't think I'm revealing anything I shouldn't, who I can like text randomly about something completely unwork related, and he will immediately get it or act like what I sent was okay. Right. And you just need a little bit of that. So
we all need people. We need people like that in our lives. So that's
Yeah.
lovely.
I could
Yeah.
send him a random key lime pie image and he'll
Oh,
appreciate it.
there it is. It had to, had to get in there somehow. I'm going to be very basic this month and just say that my life raft is central air. Because you know what? Thank you to the person who invented air conditioning and is keeping us all alive in this scorching hellscape. So on that note, Oren, I know you sometimes you want to take it away with your tagline. AC and James Pasch.
Oh, it's so blatant now. It's so, AC, it may sound like nothing, but clearly for most people listening to this in July and August, it can be everything.